Going on, Blur Gang? It's Brian. So, wanted to condense the nonsense, jump right into it. Um, the question I'm asking to the fam and hop in the comments, squat up in the jump in the comments, and let's see what we got going. Is have we been spoiled by comic book movies? I'm gonna roll the intro and then we'll get into this conversation. All right, so the question of the day is, have we been spoiled by comic book movies? And I'm going to give you a few key examples. I have a little bit of a format I'm going to run down, but at the same time, it's an open-ended conversation. So if you want to hop in the thread, hop in the chat, and we can have the conversation there too. Make sure you drop a name. So the idea is, have we been spoiled by comic book movies? And I would almost wager that as nerds, we have. And so I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why I think that we've been kind of spoiled by it in the last, probably 15, 16-ish years. Um, and get into a little bit of my history with comic book movies and then move forward from there. So the comic book movie as a concept is not something that's new. It's been around for a long time, since black and white days. You know, you could even go back and see. I think the Phantom and some of these other old vintage comic book characters had movies, and so it's not a new concept. Like the good comic book movie is a modern concept. Because it used to be that, especially when I was growing up, bro, that was the baseline, the expectation. Your baseline expectation of a comic book movie was for it to be trash. Um, and so I'm going to get a little bit more into that. But speaking of my experience, the comic book movie landscape has really been shaped in the last, I almost want to say 15 or so, some odd years. Um, I know that there's been plenty of outliers and things like that. But the reality of it is, it's been really shaped by what's happened more recently than what's happened in the past. And so when I'm speaking of it, I'm not talking about the whole landscape. I'm not even going all the way back to the old Superman, the Donner Superman, and all the other stuff. I'm talking about since the 80s and up. That's what we're getting into. And so that's the conversation we finna have. So um what was the genesis of the comic book movie? Because before, like, I almost want to say Batman in 1989 was the first kind of good comic book movie. I know that I'm leaving something out. I know I am. So feel free to correct me in the comments, but it feels like that was the first good one. But I feel almost like the 89 Batman movie, while still a comic book movie, almost feels more like a Tim Burton movie than a comic book movie. It's almost like Batman became a character in Tim Burton's ongoing cinematic universe, if that makes sense. Um, but I consider that probably one of the first good comic book movies that I can remember. And this is 1989. So I'm like 8 or 9 years old. So my bar for what a good movie was really low. And you toss in the fact that weekend trips to Blockbuster was pretty common. We got exposed to a lot of really terrible movies growing up. And so the bar for what was considered a good movie was, is this entertaining? It didn't matter if the story was coherent or anything like that. It was, is this entertaining? And even when you go back and watch the Tim Burton Batman now, it holds up pretty well. It's a pretty coherent story from point A to point B. So there's a little bit to build on there. And so I would almost consider that the first good comic book movie of the modern era. Now we go to Batman 2, or Batman Returns. That's what it was. Batman Returns. And I enjoyed that movie more than the critics did. And again, I'm like 11, 12 years old when that joint dropped. And so, 1992. So I'm about 11, 12 years old when that joint drops. And so my tastes have evolved slightly, but not to the point where I am now. And even going back and watching it, there was this darkness that we had been waiting for in a Batman movie, because I grew up reading the 80s, even the late 70s, 80s on Batman comic books. And they had a touch of really dark elements in it. And it was kind of refreshing compared to all the campiness. Now, the 90s, it went completely off the tracks with darkness, but I liked the grittier version of it. And so Tim Burton's Batman Returns introduced that grittiness. And I know that there was kind of an uproar about whether this was actually a PG-13 movie or a movie for kids. It was a movie for comic book fans. So I rocked with that movie. And so that those two movies in my mind kind of exist on an island. And then after that, the door flew open and we just got bombarded with terrible comic book movies, like atrocious comic book movies. And it ended up becoming, because, action movies kind of ran the 90s. And so you could have an action movie and people were more aligned with, let's make this comic book movie an action movie. And people won't stop to think that it doesn't make any sense and that the characters kind of ring hollow. And off the top of my head, first of all, I can think of the success of Batman movies after that Batman Returns, bro. They got progressively worse, bro. Like Batman Forever was and Batman and Robin was, you know, and there was one more in there. Batman Forever. It feels like there was one more in there. Anyway, it started getting progressively worse. And so Batman 2, that kind of was the end of that era of, okay, we got a competent comic book movie. And it ended up becoming this weird style over substance things where we had a whole bunch of action movie directors or aspiring action movie directors jumping into the comic book movie game. And so what happened after that was, and there was like, Tank Girl, you had, what was it, Judge Dredd. Tank Girl was cool. Judge Dredd, and the one that really sticks out in my mind, and I know this came out it came out between Batman and Batman 2, was that Dolph Lundgren Punisher movie. Oh my God. It's a cult classic now, but it was bad. It was not a good movie. It was not a good movie. And so the idea and what I'm trying to put over here is this. Growing up, the baseline for comic book movies was this. It's almost like equivalent to, let's say you have a toddler that makes you breakfast and you go in with the expectation that this is going to be bad. It's going to be terrible. It's not going to taste good or whatever. And so you sit down and you try it and you expect it to be bad, and it isn't bad. It is bad, but your expectations aren't really hurt by that. What will really subvert your expectations is if that toddler whipped up an amazing breakfast. Like, it would be notable. You would be calling the press, get this kid all over social media. This 3-year-old hooked up breakfast. It was amazing. And I really didn't have to steer them in any way, shape, or form. They understood flavors and how to put things together, and they just hooked it up. That's kind of where comic book movies were in the late 80s, early 2000s, just kind of hovering around the bottom of the barrel. And so Blade came out, and Blade was good. And we were shocked. Like, Blade was dope, bro. Like, Blade kind of changed how I perceived comic book movies at that point in time. And so I'm like, okay, so this can actually work. This can actually be a medium where it can be good. Because like I said, there were so many bad comic book movies. And so I got a list. And so I'm going to kind of go through some of them and talk about what my experience was. And I think the thing that hurts the most is I was really excited about some of these movies, bro, like deeply excited. And, you just keep going back to the same one that hurt you over and over again. So, notably, so we're talking about after Batman Returns, later, or Batman and Robin. I think that was the last one. Correct me if I'm wrong, if that wasn't the last one. Before they just finally, they just buried that franchise in, Anyway, 1997, we had Spawn. I was excited about Spawn. The HBO Spawn was dope. It's probably still one of my favorite adaptations of a comic book in any medium. I'm talking about animated, live action, whatever. HBO Spawn was amazing. Um, and so I was excited about Spawn dropping, bro. Like in theaters, like I'm gonna go see Spawn, and I was really excited about it. And I went to go see Spawn. Y'all, it wasn't just special effects or anything. It wasn't a coherent story. The characters were cool, the actors were good, more or less. The direction was the special effects for the time were all right, but it wasn't coherent. It just was loud, but anyway. Spawn hurt my feelings because I was a huge Spawn fan growing up, bro. Like when it first came out, when Tom McFarlane dropped Spawn, man, that hit the streets like the crack epidemic, bro. Like they hit the comic book nerd community like it was the most amazing thing, and Image Comics was on the map. And then the movie Spawn came out in 1997, and we're just like, what is this? This is ugh. I already spoke about The Punisher from 1989. Cult classic, but just I don't know. I can't even really put it into words. I think Dolph Lundgren did aight. But it felt like your standard revenge mob movie. Like they could have done that. Like it was just they could have put Charles Bronson. Basically, this was Death Wish, except it was the Punisher. And it didn't really feel like anything comic booky, to be quite honest with you. I know somewhere in there was that Captain America straight to video release, and I actually rented that because Blockbuster was a thing and it was popular. It was on and popping to go to Blockbuster every weekend and find movies to rent, and so we rented that. And I was young enough to be impressed by everything, and I remember that movie being bad. So if you're starting to see the trend here, there was a whole long gap where comic book movies were just the worst. We jump ahead a little bit, and I'm trying to get my timelines down because I know Spider-Man dropped, and there was a little bit of a gap of people were trying to rush in and fill the void and copy the success that Spider-Man had, that first Spider-Man movie, because now we're into okay, this is actually a good movie, and it wasn't directly Marvel. I think that was that weird Marvel Fox hybrid where Fox owned the rights, like they did with X-Men, where Fox owned the rights to the IP of Spider-Man, and so that kind of fell in there. We also had the X-Men movie, which I think I was a little bit harsher on than I probably should have been, um, just because it didn't neatly fit into my experience with the Claremont X-Men that I grew up with. And so I was a little bit harsher on that X-Men movie. And I go back and forth with it because even till this day, I don't necessarily like Wolverine being the main central character in the X-Men movie and eventually the X-Men franchise, but I understand it. So that X-Men movie dropped in 2000. And so we had Blade in 1998, then we had X-Men. Okay, we got two serviceable comic book movies. Let's see if we keep the trend. Blade 2. All right, Blade 2 was dope. Blade 2, the same year that Spider-Man movie dropped. Okay, we're building some momentum. Then Daredevil just came out and hit us with the right hook. And here's the thing. I don't think the Ben Affleck Daredevil was exactly a bad movie. Like, I know it was famous to dunk on that movie when it dropped, but I don't necessarily think it was a bad movie. The Evanescence playing was pretty over the top, and some of the scenes were kind of campy. The Jennifer Garner as Elektra was in. I mean, I understood she was in Alias, and so that was kind of they considered her the action girl and stuff. So I get it, but I like Marco Clark Duncan as Kingpin. I thought he kind of fit the role of a Kingpin. Colin Farrell, as Colin Farrell. Yeah, it was Colin Farrell as Bullseye. I thought it was an interesting take on the character of Bullseye. Um, so it wasn't all the way bad. It just wasn't all the way good either. And so I don't necessarily want to throw it on the slander pile. Um, X2, that's everybody's, everybody considers that the peak of the X-Men franchise. I thought it was good. I was expecting a little bit more out of a retelling of the Dark Phoenix, um, out of the Phoenix saga, more or less. And, I know that it was an interpretation of it. I thought it was a good movie. I did leave expecting a little bit more, and I kind of liked I think I liked there are bits of pieces of the first X-Men movie I liked better than X2, but I still think X2 was probably the best of that franchise, up until First Class. Um, and even, I think even X2 was a little bit better than First Class. That's just my take on it. Ang Lee's Hulk visually was an amazing movie. To me, it was a visually amazing movie. Not enough Hulk, surprisingly. Now, I still have yet to see a Hulk movie that really, when he fought the military in the desert, that was amazing. And that little set piece where he's fighting the helicopters and throwing missiles at throwing missiles back and throwing tanks and stuff, that was really dope. And that was kind of a throwback, to me, to the old Hulk comics where it's the military chased them down. I was in for that. It was a lot of the other movies that was around it, which was, you had to get through a lot. And it was a lot of good character development, but I feel like it could have been abridged a little bit more. But as you see, we're starting to pick up steam where it's starting to get more consistent, where there's good comic book movies coming out. I already talked about the Punisher movie. This is this other Punisher movie with Thomas Jane. And it wasn't bad. It was odd. And I think that's the best way to describe it. It was just it was an odd Punisher. It was an odd movie. It wasn't bad. And there were scenes that really felt like the Punisher. I think Thomas Jane was okay as the Punisher, Frank Castle. I could get with that. I don't think it matched what old boy did in the Netflix show. I mean, that's like the peak Punisher on film to me. But it was there. It was serviceable. It wasn't bad. It wasn't like the best movie I've ever seen, and it could be kind of forgettable considering that it came in the same year as Spider-Man 2, which was Spider-Man 2 was it, bro. Like Spider-Man 2, they had figured out, okay, this is how we make a comic book movie, and this is how we pay homage to parts of the comic book, but also how we tell a transformative story that crosses over and makes sense in a story in a movie format. And so Spider-Man 2 is really the peak of it. And so I think the Punisher was kind of hurt by that. But yeah, Spider-Man 2 was dope. And that was one of the very first really, really, really good comic book movies. I'm talking about good, like, as just as a movie in general, but not only as a comic book movie, but as a movie in general. Just an excellent movie. Blade Trinity happened. It hurt my feelings. Blade Trinity did kind of hurt my feelings because it was just kind of like, but Blade Trinity happened, and we experienced it happening together. That's what I will say about it. And I think even the actors who played in it were just like, this thing kind of happened, and it wasn't. It just hit. It was there. It wasn't a hit. It wasn't a huge miss, but it's just a thing that happened. Then Elektra. Elektra is probably one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen lots of horrible movies in my lifetime. Again, I am either elder millennial or I am a baby Gen Xer. So I've seen a lot of horrible movies in my life. And I think the line is I've seen movies that weren't they were trying to be good, but they were just bad. Then I've seen movies that are bad for bad sake. Elektra was trying to be good, but it just failed in every aspect of a comic book movie. Like the plot didn't make any sense. I didn't care about her or anything that happened to her. It was just a mess. It was an absolute mess. It was a cash grab. It is one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. And I was working in a group home, and the boys in the group home loved the movie. I think I know why, but for me, it was a complete and utter miss. Just abysmal. It almost made me give up faith. Like, oh man, I thought we were going somewhere with comic book movies, and then Elektra drops, and it just took all the oxygen out of the room. And we kind of stumbled from there into Fantastic Four, and that just is a um, and the tough part with Fantastic Four is those that know me know that I will fight you to the ground about Ben Grimm. That's one of my favorite characters. The Thing is one of my favorite comic book characters. Period, bro. Like he's just that's my dude. The Thing is my dude, and that was a very tough. That was a hard pill to swallow. I think Michael Chiklis did cool as Ben Grimm. Um, the Fantastic Four was just, Doctor Doom was wrong. Doctor Doom was all wrong. I wasn't too pissed off about. I wasn't too mad, to be quite honest with you. I wasn't too mad about the casting of the other Fantastic Four. I thought they all did fine. I think it was kind of the scripting. I think the movie was poorly written, and I think maybe that's what kind of did me in for that movie. Like the script was awful. I didn't understand what we were trying to do with Doctor Doom. Um, I didn't understand his origin stories, and I think he's probably the villain that's been done the most disservice. Well, we still have to talk about Fantastic Four Part Two, Rise of the Silver Surfer, and talk about Galactus. But Doctor Doom has been messed up a couple of different times on film, and I don't think that he's ever really gotten his shine for what he is. If there's ever such thing as a heroic villain, Doom's it, bro. Like he's a heroic villain, and I'll die on that hill, bro. Like I'm standing on that, bro. Doctor Doom is the perfect heroic villain, where he commits acts of villainy, but he is so entrenched in his beliefs that he honestly believes that he's doing the right thing. Because it serves his end, and at the end of the day, it's Doom's will be done, and that's kind of how it rolls. And so, I mess with that. That level of irrational confidence. Like he's the poster child for irrational confidence, even though a lot of his confidence is rational. And so, it was hard to watch them do my boy Doctor Doom like that, bro. Like it was really tough. Um, so anyway, let's keep going down the list here. And I know I haven't gone down the DC side as much, so I'm gonna be back and forth between that because what I've left out is Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, Steel, Catwoman, all trash, all trash, like all of them. Just one was worse than the other one, and that's where the bar started getting driven down. DC kind of bounced back a little bit before Marvel did, to be quite honest with you, because Constantine wasn't bad, bro. Like Constantine was dope. It wasn't cleanly, it wasn't cleanly the Hellblazer, what I was looking for, but it was dope. And I'm like, I was almost hoping that Swamp Thing showed up somewhere along the line. But I could rock with Constantine. Catwoman was the bottom. Like that was just abysmal, dude. Like that was the bottom. And I know it got panned, but I knew it was gonna be bad. When I first saw the trailer, like, oh, this is gonna be terrible. And then my expectations were met. Just like the concept of the toddler fixing you breakfast. You know that the breakfast is gonna be bad. It's just how bad is it gonna be? And is it gonna be something you're gonna be able to fake through, or maybe have good memories of, or will it make you sick? And Catwoman is that thing that'll make you sick. Because right after same year Constantine dropped, Batman Begins dropped, and so that kind of saved DC's movies for a little bit. And so I kind of rock with that. So I'm gonna circle back to that one. So we had Fantastic Four, we had X-Men The Last Stand, which was the worst X-Men movie. And at this point, Marvel was literally just taking stock characters from the X-Men mythos, like random mutants, and just throwing them into a movie. No concern for characterization. This wasn't Marvel, this was Fox, actually. Fox was just dropping random mutants on and putting them on the screen. No consistency with powers, no characterization. They all they had was just code names, and they just kept rapid firing mutants at us. And it got to the point where we couldn't even tell who was who and who's the bad guy, who are the villains of that movie. We know it's Magneto and Juggernaut, and that's about it. And then a bunch of other random, and just a random collection, a random assortment, a menagerie of different mutants, and none of them were really right. I think they even had Psylocke in there, and she was like had wings and spitting acid. It was just ugh. And that was the low part. That was the low point of that X-Men franchise to me. Well, Days of Future Past wasn't too bad. The Dark Phoenix was bad, and Apocalypse was, but I still think that X-Men: The Last Stand was kind of the bottom of the barrel for that. Ghost Rider. I'm gonna shock the world. I didn't think Ghost Rider was terrible. I didn't think it was good, but I didn't think it was terrible. I think Nick Cage was the perfect person to play Johnny Cage at the time. I think there's better actors now, but at the time, Nick Cage was kind of sliding off the deep end. And so this is right before he just went on that spree of just making every movie that is possible to shoot. And so I could kind of get with that. And I'm wrapping up my list here so I can get into the bigger points of what I wanted to say. Spider-Man 3, it happened. And we got Venom, whether we wanted Venom or not. And it kind of did an injustice to the character of Venom. I don't blame Topher Grace. Bro took what they laid in front of him. I don't blame Sam Raimi. I know that there was a ton of studio interference. He kind of wanted to do a return of the Green Goblin. I was all for it. Maybe even do throw a Rhino in there and have that kind of going on and make it into something else. And realistically, it just didn't pan out like that. They had to throw in, the studio wanted Venom in there for their own reasons, and they didn't care how he was portrayed. And so, that was kind of a wash. Yeah. Let's see. What did I skip over? Spider-Man 3. I already talked about that. Rise of the Silver Surfer, Fantastic Four. That movie hurt my feelings. It absolutely hurt my feelings, bro. The Silver Surfer hurt my feelings. Galactus hurt my feelings. Galactus was just a giant cloud of stuff, just a big cloud. And I understand that there was, the ultimate Galactus was, basically a fleet of ships, and it was a hive mind, and it was really just stupid. I understand it, and sometimes it's best to leave the ultimate Marvel universe in the ultimate Marvel universe and not adapt it. And I think that's what happened. I would have messed with the big, huge humanoid Galactus, and we could have dealt with that. And it just felt like this big anticlimactic blah. And it rightfully killed that iteration of the Fantastic Four franchise. And good riddance, because it hurt my feelings. I don't think you'll understand. That was a bad movie, and I went in with high expectations and was utterly disappointed, like mad about putting my money into that. So we're jumping back over to DC because I need a palate cleanser from that. Batman Begins came out, Christopher Nolan's first Batman. It was amazing. It was a good retelling of the Batman mythos, a lot more grounded. Didn't include a lot of the superhero-y aspects of it. It had some Nolan-isms, but I could rock with it. And so it was a well-done Batman movie. And it was something we had been waiting on since Batman Returns. Superman Returns. This is another one that kind of hurt my feelings. And it wasn't bad. It was a great kind of character study about what makes Superman awesome if you just took all the action out of it. Like if you had no expectation for anything to happen in a Superman movie, this is a Superman movie for you. If you walk in with no expectation of anything heroic or action filled to happen, it's just Superman flying around, bullets bouncing off of him, catching airplanes. This is the Superman movie for you. It turned into Oz, like right at the end, while the Superman gets shanked up and drugged by his face and almost drowned in a puddle. That was wild. That third act was wild. Like it turned from a Superman movie where nothing's happening to a Superman movie where it's like he walked in the Oz and Lex Luthor stabs him in the back with a kryptonite shank and then breaks the shank off in his back, and his henchmen start beating him up and try to drown him in a puddle. And it was a wild ride, bro. Like it was this jarring, unexpected thing that just happened, and it just happened to the whole theater. Little kids was crying, bro. It was a surreal experience in the theater, yo. Like we went to go see that Superman. I took my group home kids to go see it, right? And we're sitting there, and I could tell the group home kids are younger versions of me with ADHD and poor impulse control, and they really are having a tough time sitting through this really boring character study analysis of a creepy Superman. And we're just struggling through it. And then the third act happens, and everybody in the theater is like, what? And I remember very distinctly when Superman got stabbed, little kids in the theater just started bawling, like, oh my God, what is happening? And parents are trying to explain how this turned so dark so suddenly when quite literally nothing has happened through the whole movie. And then in like a 10-minute sequence, Superman's son apparently, I don't know how that happened. They never really clearly explained it. But Superman's son apparently crushes somebody with a piano, and then Superman's getting shanked up and drowned. It was a wild ride. It was one of the most memorable movie experiences I've ever had. It wasn't for a good reason, but it was memorable. And so that's why I got love for that Superman Returns, because it really subverted expectations, because it was boring as all hell until it happened. And then it was the best and worst Superman movie I've ever seen in one sitting. Like the best and worst. It was great. It was really great. So I think we're going to, and then of course the Dark Knight, and that kind of explains itself. That was kind of the peak of the Batman franchise. Like nothing has really beaten the Dark Knight in the Batman franchise until that point. And it's been kind of a downward slope until after that. Let's see, we're going to jump back to Marvel, because after Rise of the Silver Surfer, we had some time to reconsider comic book movies, because it really felt like we was getting better. Then Iron Man dropped and changed the game. Like now, the bar is set high, because Iron Man was dope. Iron Man was what we needed. It was competently written, well acted, special effects was on point. It was funny. It was action packed. There was emotion in it. It just felt like a full, complete movie. And it felt like a modern update to what we had been used to in comic book movies, where the original expectation is we were shocked if the movie was good, and now we're going to shocked how good this movie actually was. Now, you go back and look, and yeah, there's some plot holes and things along those lines, but the Iron Man was kind of that game changer for Marvel Studio proper. Now we're talking about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and there were still Marvel related properties in other studios. So I'm gonna get to those because right after that was Punisher Warzone, which I thought was an amazing movie, but it wasn't for the same reason. Not because it was good. It was the most gory, over the top stylized, violent movie I've ever seen up until that Rambo reboot. I've never just watching people get vaporized with machine gun fire and just it was amazing. It was a symphony of the most violent things that you could ever see. It was a Punisher movie. It was the first one they actually got it right. He is not a hero. He's nobody that you should be looking up to. He saves people, yeah, but he will punish the guys that deserve it, and you to the point where you actually feel bad for the criminals. As atrocious as the stuff that they did in that movie, Frank Castle was worse. And again, it was an incredible. I couldn't take my eyes off of it, and it wasn't because it was this great movie. It was just because it was this tableau of unyielding, unrelenting violence. It's the most one of the most violent movies I've ever laid eyes on. Um, and that's what made it really kind of this awesome thing. I need to look up when that Rambo reboot dropped because um, that Rambo reboot. I don't know. I think they came out around the same time. Um, and yeah, Rambo came out in 2008, and I think that Punisher movie came out around 2008 too. Um, yeah, Punisher Warzone came out the same year as Rambo because I remember like watching Rambo vaporize somebody with a mounted machine gun, and I was like, oh my god. Um, but it was an amazing movie. It just wasn't a good movie, but it was just I couldn't take my eyes off of it. We go from that, X-Men Origins Wolverine. eh, And so maybe my thesis is a little bit wrong about this. Maybe I'm talking directly about the Marvel Cinematic Universe kind of kicked off in 2008, and it was the expectation for comic book movies to be good because 20th Century Fox was still dropping side franchises and stuff, and those movies weren't good. X-Men Origins Wolverine, they took the Merc with the mouth, Deadpool, and sewed his mouth shut. I, I, and this was the problem with the X-Men franchise where they made Wolverine the main character. It really was. Um, but I think maybe I can draw the line around and say the Marvel movies started raising the expectation for comic book movies to actually be good, coherent, competent movies. And everybody else is still trying to figure the game out. Let me jump back over to DC, see what's happening in 2008. So we had The Dark Knight, which was self-explanatory. Watchmen, I wasn't too mad about Watchmen. I realized that Zack Snyder is an amazing visual storyteller, and he did good with adapting something that was written on the page. I did find out later on after watching that Superman joint and then the Batman versus Superman, he's not so great with original stories and coming up with his own tellings of these stories. But when he's adapting a comic book panel for panel, he's really good. And I liked Watchmen. I didn't have the same problem with it. I know the creators of Watchmen weren't really rocking with it, and I understand exactly why because they've been feeling exploited by DC for decades. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons have really been exploited by DC, but I didn't think Watchmen was necessarily a bad movie. I'll be honest with you, I've seen Jonah Hex at least 4 or 5 times, and I don't remember any of it besides Megan Fox was in it. So that's where Jonah Hex is. I'm thinking that was probably good enough. There's a reason why I blocked it out of my memory. Green Lantern. I didn't think Green Lantern was actually a bad movie. I think they kind of nailed it. Ryan Reynolds as Hal Jordan. To be quite honest with you, I wasn't too pissed off by that. I thought that they got the character of Hal Jordan. I think that they did rush a lot of elements of it. Like they tried to do too much in one movie. I think they could have made the extended Hector Hammond's part and not had to go through the whole Parallax thing. I think the Parallax was something you build up to. I think including Parallax as the big bad monster that had to be defeated at the end of the movie, that was the bridge too far. Because when you read the comic books, Parallax was something that they worked up to, and it was kind of a retcon to explain why Hal became evil in the first place in the comic books. And so I think it overreached and tried to do too much in one movie, but I don't think it was necessarily a bad movie. And I wasn't mad about Ryan Reynolds. I think he did good as Hal Jordan. I think he was the perfect Hal Jordan. Uh, just like I wasn't mad at Ben Affleck as Daredevil. I think he did good as Matt Murdock. I think the actors they picked was fine for it. I just the outcome of the movie wasn't that great. All right, we're gonna abridge this because I can go through the whole list and list off the movies. Here's what I'm gonna say. So when I say we've been spoiled by comic book movies, it used to be the baseline was bad. Um, you went into a comic book movie and expecting it to not be good, and we're genuinely walked away surprised when you actually got a competent film. And now we're so used to comic book movies being coherent and competently done that now we're nitpicking on, well, the visual effects weren't that good, or I found too many jokes in the movie, and stuff like that. That we have we have the pretentiousness to pretend like for the longest time, especially for the blurs my age, and close to my age, um, comic book movies were the worst. Like there are all kinds of different movies, but you knew that if you were going to a comic book movie, you were probably going to be disappointed, and it wasn't going to be good. And so, um, I think when I say we've been spoiled by it, I think we've been spoiled by having good, competent comic book movies. Now, I'm not saying that gives an excuse to not develop, for people, for directors and actors to phone it in on comic book movies. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is, I do think that we've reached this point where we kind of expect it, and that hasn't been the norm historically. And now we're expecting competence. And so now we can say, well, and the Quantum Mania, the visual effects were just, ugh, and there were too many jokes. Okay. But if we take that same Ant-Man movie and put it in the 90s, it would have been the goofiest shit that you ever seen in your life. To the point where it would have been, it would have had a cult following because of how bad it was. And so I do think we need to balance out what our expectations are. Um, and I think that we did revisit exactly what it could look like when a comic book movie has all the flash and none of the substance. And so now I'm about to go pick on Zack Snyder. So if you like Batman versus Superman, be prepared to argue because we about to chop this. um, I think Batman versus Superman is kind of the bell. It was kind of a hallmark of. It was kind of a throwback in the sense of it was. It had a good cast, had a big budget. Studio went all in on it, and the story did not hold up at all. It just didn't. It was confusing. Even the extended, and I know that. Well, if you watch the extended cut, it fills in the gaps. I've seen the extended cut. Even the parts they filled in was stupid, and so I think that was the one where it was kind of a throwback to where this was actually kind of a bad comic book movie. And to be quite honest with you, um, when it was strictly Marvel Cinematic Universe, because at the time I was like, I'm not watching anything outside of the MCU, or at least I'm not giving equal time to it because Fox had just been disappointment after disappointment after disappointment until they kind of figured things out with the Wolverine franchise. And so um, I think Batman versus Superman was kind of a signature moment where it did kind of hurt my feelings a little bit too. And around that time, that's when the Netflix Marvel shows were starting to kick up. And so you had other good retellings of comic book franchises out there floating around. And so there was a lot to compare how, and I know that there's going to be fans of Batman versus Superman, and I know y'all ready to fight me on this one, but it wasn't a good movie. And I think that was kind of the sign. And I'm going to do a longer podcast about what went wrong with that one because there's a lot of other things I want to discuss with it. But just I think it was a throwback to the bad comic book movies where the story took a huge backseat to the visual spectacle of the whole thing. And um, elements didn't make sense, characterizations didn't match up. Lex Luthor was the Riddler or the Joker. Batman was running around with a branding iron, branding people like a serial killer. Um, Superman was just kind of this ineffectual dude who was just happened to be there. Doomsday came out of nowhere. Wonder Woman just showed up. Um, for whatever reason, the Flash just popped up in there, like, "Hey, what's up, y'all?" and was out. And they spent so much time setting up the DC, the reboot or reestablishment of the DC cinematic universe, that they didn't bother telling us a good story to get us invested in it. I think Aquaman for the DC was kind of an outlier because Aquaman was really competent and it was a nice refreshing thing after that Batman versus Superman kind of debacle. I'm not saying it was atrocious. I'm not saying it was the worst movie we've ever seen. I was saying it was a disappointing movie. So anyway, I think that collectively we've been spoiled. And when I say that, I mean, we've set the bar too high for comic book movies. And so we can nitpick elements of the plot and stuff. But the only reason we can do that is because we have a baseline of, okay, we've seen what actually good comic book movies can be. And so now we're using that as a reference point to evaluate the bad ones. And it's dope that we've reached that point where we have enough good representations of the medium to really explain it. And so I'm kind of happy with that aspect of it. I'm gonna take a quick pause for the cause, and I will be right back. All right, we're back. So I think that when I say spoiled, I do honestly believe that we've had it good for so long that we expect every comic book movie to drop, specifically from either Marvel or DC. We're expecting that it's going to be this thing that raises the bar and blazes a new trail, and we're not happy with good enough anymore. And it's kind of a weird thing because I feel like specifically like watching what's happening with how fans are reacting to James Gunn on Twitter, and him trying to salvage the DC cinematic universe. And it needs salvaging. I'm gonna be honest with y'all. I know that a lot of y'all uh Snyder cut folks think that it was just the Snyder version was just this perfect vision of a DC movie. And I'm here to tell you that it was the ultimate, the Snyder vision of what the DC universe was, the ultimate, style over substance piece. Um, and the characters still weren't really fleshed out. And there's just a lot of gaps narratively. And it was kind of told with how Wonder Woman was in her first movie. Now the second movie, Wonder Woman 84 was, but that first Wonder Woman movie was pretty good, and it kind of shows what um, happened when it wasn't Zack Snyder kind of driving the boat. Um, I think that we kind of got screwed out of. I think Batman versus Superman should have been a couple of Batman movies and not necessarily a Superman movie. I think we needed some time between that first Superman movie and Batman versus Superman. So if you're going to introduce Batman, have him work a case, do something specifically in Gotham, and then it crosses over to Metropolis to set the stage for the Batman versus Superman movie. And even the concept of Batman versus Superman was just to me. And I remember very clearly seeing the poster for Batman versus Superman in I Am Legend, and it really hit me as Warner Brothers has this IP that they don't want to let go. And so, by God, they're going to give us a Batman versus Superman movie. And we're going to base it on the insane ramblings of Frank Miller. The Frank Miller characterization of Batman in The Dark Knight Returns, with the suit. or Dark Knight Returns Part 2, I think it was Part 2. Um, where now he's fighting Superman for some reason, just because he's the goddamn Batman. Um, and I feel like they said, we have this name, Batman versus Superman. Sounds like it will put butts in seats, and so we're just going to go forward with it, regardless of whether it makes sense or not. You know, that's like having we're gonna have Spider-Man versus Iron Man, the movie. Why? Why are they fighting each other? You can give me an idea, and and that sounds weird, because think about it. I think about it. We had Civil War with Captain America versus Iron Man, but there was a whole story that kind of underpinned that led up to that. Batman versus Superman was, he got mad because his building fell down, and rightfully so. The building fell down, killed a bunch of people he cared about. Okay, I get it. But it's almost like Batman couldn't see that the world was about to be destroyed. Like, literally, the world was about to end, and Superman prevented the world from ending. And instead of looking at it like, okay, well, yeah, unfortunate this thing happened, and these people, and I'm really sad about it, it turned into, I must go kill Superman. Why? He saved the world. Well, he knocked over a building while he was doing it, so I got to go kill him. It didn't make any sense. So I could understand Civil War better than I could understand Batman versus Superman, and they spent a little bit more time. They had the other movies to reference. They have in Civil War, they referenced what happened on the Avengers movies and the destruction in the Avengers movies, and they really gave it an ideological twist to it. Where it's like, okay, this is where Captain America and Iron Man's ideologies cross, and this is what it creates. I got that piece of it. I think that they moved too fast with Batman versus Superman. So anyway, that was the first throwback to kind of the bad-ish comic book movies. Now, I think people are too harsh on James Gunn. I think people are too harsh on, even elements of comedy within the Marvel movies, because, I wasn't, I think like Thor: Love and Thunder, it wasn't the best comic book movie I've ever seen, but we had a good time. Me and the kids had a good time, and that was really what it was. The kids had a fun time, and it was their first time sitting down and watching a Thor movie, and they were left with a good impression of it, to the point where they wanted to go back and watch the other Thor movies, and I could rock with that. I think people are too harsh on Marvel's addressing of pop culture and humor in their movies, and they're expecting this hard, gritty edge. And I think DC was too enamored with the hard, gritty edge and not really making an enjoyable movie. The way I could almost describe Batman versus Superman and Man of Steel and Justice League as, I could almost say they were unpleasant movies. They weren't bad. They were just unpleasant. They were loud, washed out. Justice League tried to throw in some humor with some Joss Whedon, and that went over like a fart in church. And they were just narratively inconsistent. So, but I do think even my criticisms of those DC movies is weak, because at the end of the day, if I'm comparing the modern DC movies, the Zack Snyder DC movies, to what we had to endure to lead up to this point where we got a chance to have Zack Snyder DC movies, those movies are like Oscar caliber movies, because comic book movies, the expectation was they were bad. They were supposed to be bad up until that point. And so that's where I'm trying to be fair to the medium and genre. And I think it doesn't help that effectively, there's a population of, cinema goers who are like, oh, I'm so sick of comic book movies. Like, they're like, you don't have to go watch them, right? Like, you don't have to go see them. They're out there for me to enjoy and take my kids to. If you don't want to watch it, cool. Go watch what you want to watch. I'll watch what I want to watch. Be cool. But we're acting like comic book movies are happening to the exclusion of other films, and it's really not. But if we're comparing the worst modern, and I'm talking about 2008 and on, the worst modern comic book movies versus the worst comic book movies of all time, there's no real comparison. Even the worst 2008 after comic book movie is way better than what we were getting in the 90s on a regular basis. Just it's not even close, bro. Like if we take Batman versus Superman and put that up against that Spawn movie, bro, like the Spawn movie looks like Manuel's Hands of Fate compared to that movie. It looks like something that should be on Mystery Science Theater 3000. Um, it doesn't hold up. The plot doesn't make any sense. The story is barely coherent. The visual, like nothing about that movie stands up at all. The action sequences are trash. Quite literally, the only thing you can say is possibly the acting. And even then, as over dramatic and stuff as Batman versus Superman was at times, it was still a better movie than Spawn in 1997. It's not even close, bro. If we take Thomas Jane's Punisher movie and compare it to the Dolph Lundgren 1989 Punisher movie that most of y'all don't even remember, don't even know it exists. You don't even know that movie exists, bro. That's how bad it was. I don't even think it went to theaters. I think they just dropped that straight to video. Like that movie dropped and went to Blockbuster. It didn't go anywhere else because they're like, there's no hope for this movie. And we rented it because I'm like, oh man, the Punisher, yo. We rented it. And at 9 years old, I knew it was a bad movie. Do you know what I thought was cool at 9 years old, bro? Like I thought all kinds of stuff was cool at 9 years old. I liked the cartoon version of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles way more than I liked the comic book version. And there's no accounting for taste when it comes to that. So if I knew a movie was bad at 9 years old, what does that say now? So even the weirdo Thomas Jane, or even the hyper violent Punisher Warzone movie, both of those are head and shoulders above that Dolph Lundgren Punisher movie. And I'll be honest with you, the expectation back in the day was they were going to be terrible. Let's look at Dredd. Let's look at Dredd versus Judge Dredd. Judge Dredd was literally just Demolition Man, but with Judge Dredd. Demolition Man with Judge Dredd. It wasn't bad as an action movie of the 90s, but it sure as hell was not a comic book movie. And Dredd, the newer version with I think it was Carl Urban, that one is so much better than the Sylvester Stallone version of Judge Dredd. It's not even funny. The Sylvester Stallone version of Judge Dredd, you go back and watch it, and you can laugh out loud at some of the ridiculous stuff in it. And I'm not even saying that Judge Dredd, like I think that Sylvester Stallone actually made a serviceable Judge Dredd. The facial expressions and everything, but it was not a good movie by any stretch of the imagination. And so the modern Dredd, which was kind of the people's champ of comic book movies for a while, was head and shoulders above that movie. And so what I'm saying is this: I think we've been kind of spoiled by how good comic book movies are, and that's the crux of everything I'm saying right now. I think we've been spoiled by it because beforehand, we expected trash and we got trash. That's what it is. I know I'm jumping all over the place. Anybody, if you have any comments or anything, feel free to jump in. Like I said, I think 2008 was kind of that turning point with the official launch of the MCU. I think DC struggled, and I think a lot of DC's problems were the fact that they didn't copy what worked in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They tried to shortcut it. Instead of building an actual cinematic universe, they tried to do it in one or two movies, and that's just not how it was going to get done. You need a little bit more of a runway to do that stuff. But even then, those DC movies aren't bad. Justice League isn't as bad as Batman and Robin. It's not even close. Justice League is head and shoulders above Batman and Robin. But Batman and Robin was a major theater release, and people rightfully said this is a terrible movie, but it still made its money. Meanwhile, Justice League kind of got cascaded, and it fell off the map. And it wasn't a great movie, but it wasn't as bad as bad could be. That's what I'm saying. So I think current filmmakers do have a formula for comic book movies, more or less, where you mix in some humor. There's going to be some that really don't lend to humor, and so they find ways to work around it. But talking to the breaking the fourth wall, Easter eggs in movies and things like that. I think that they've kind of figured out a little bit of a formula. I do think Marvel's kind of relied on the formula too much, and people are kind of expecting them to upset the apple cart and give us something that was truly jaw dropping. But I do think, from even a jaw dropping standpoint, I don't think, and I think Marvel fan and comic book fans have to get this out of their mind. We're never going to have another moment like it was in a Marvel movie. I don't think we're ever going to experience anything like we experienced at the end of Infinity War. I don't think we're ever going to experience anything like we did at the end of Winter Soldier. I don't think we're going to experience anything like that. And so the idea that you're going to this movie's going to hit you and rock you to your core and leave you stunned silence, I don't think we're going to experience that again. Or the joy of Black Panther and how that was just really, seeing it in theaters was really kind of this super unique, fun experience, almost a celebration of going to a comic book movie. I don't know if we're going to experience that again. I'm hoping we do, but we've already experienced it. What else can top that? What can Marvel do that will absolutely leave an entire theater in stunned silence like the end of Infinity War? I've never experienced anything like that in a movie theater before. Never. And I've seen like Schindler's List and all kinds of other really just jarring, rocking, impactful movies. But I've never seen an action movie or a supposed to be fun or frivolous movie just leave everybody jaws, mouths hanging open, stunned silence, looking at each other to confirm what just happened. I've never experienced that in a movie theater before. And I think that kind of moment won't happen again. And I think we need to stop expecting every single comic book movie to do that to us. Even if DC finds their equivalent, I don't think they're going to do something that rocks us like that. It was such a unique moment and such level of anticipation of what's going to happen. And finally, this decade-long story pays off in a way that nobody was really expecting, unless you actually read, the Infinity Gauntlet saga, and you knew that Thanos wins. It's got to end with Thanos winning, and then the next story is, okay, so now how do we get our link back, and how do we fix this after he wins? And that's where the next part of the story. I've never seen anything like that. I've never seen in a comic book movie like loud cheers and applause at the end, in the climax battle of Endgame. I've never experienced that in a comic book movie. And I don't think it's fair for us to expect every comic book movie to take us there again, because it was such a unique thing that happened kind of in a bottle that I think our expectations are too high for that. I think we set the bar too high. And instead of being pleasantly surprised when it's highly competent and well done, I think we expect everything to be highly competent and well done. And unfortunately, it can't be that level all the time. I think Marvel kind of peaked with that. Now, are they going to be able to do something with this Kang story? Maybe. All the Jonathan Major stuff throws everything into doubt, because they did find the actor that could pull it off and seem like a legitimate threat. And I know that they're working up toward the Galactus saga, which will really be amazing. But they have to go through and get us to reconnect with new Avengers in their roles. And they've been kind of stumbling a little bit. Sam as Captain America, I enjoyed Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Thought it was dope. I can see where people didn't necessarily connect with the character. I think they might have connected with Bucky Cap a little bit better. I know it's tough to say, but I think that they might have. But Sam as Captain America, okay, we're gonna give it a shot. We're gonna see what happens in New World Order and see what they do. But I think what happened was Marvel actually got us to really invest and root for the character. And so I think that they've captured that lightning in a bottle with this with the newest reboot of the Spider-Man franchise, the home series. I think they've done it with the animated Spider-Man series, where the audience is super hyper invested into the characters. Marvel's got to be able to find that again. We didn't necessarily do that with Riri Williams. We didn't necessarily do that with Sherry. And so I think that's the piece that they're missing is that connection, because the thing that got us invested in the current Marvel, the current MCU was Tony Stark as Iron Man, because he was a guy that was you kind of wanted to cheer for. He was the scoundrel that you wanted to cheer for. And you ended up liking Captain America because when he started getting around the Avengers and letting it and stop being Mr. Uptight, there was some fun elements of him. Even switching the Hulk out, which was kind of shocking, but you kind of felt you like, okay, I like Mark Ruffalo. I like Thor. We're seeing new dimensions of who Thor is. He's not this haughty toddy, guy who talks like he just walked out of a Shakespeare play. And so you started to actually like the characters. And I think that's the thing that DC's has to do. And I think James Gunn is the guy to do it. I think he can craft relatable characters. He did it with was it Peacemaker? The Peacemaker series. I'm excited to see what happens with Peacemaker. I thought it was good. When he took over Suicide Squad, I was invested in those characters. And so I think James Gunn is the guy to do it for DC. Ezra Miller, that they weren't the great. It was hard for me to root for Ezra as Flash. A lot of it had to do with how he ran funny, but the other side of it was all the other stuff, being the abuser and stuff like that. Just wasn't feeling him. But I think James Gunn has the ability to create that. But I think the idea is, and the overall concept is, I'm not saying we have to drop our expectations. I'm not even saying we have to lower our expectations for comic book movies. I think we need to keep our expectations in check for what we're getting and understand that we've reached the era and the point in time where we have a baseline formula and expectation for comic book movies. And then we judge them on their own merits independently. But we don't just say, well, just because this didn't tick all the boxes, it's the worst thing that ever happened to comic book movies. I think we awfulize a lot of movies that disappoint us a little bit. We awfulize them online and stuff like that. And where we're like, this is a little bit disappointing. We make it the worst thing that's ever happened. Oh, this creator's rolling in his grave. No, if they were alive, they would be amazed to see their creation brought to life. And so I think that we just got to pull back on it a little bit. I do hope James Gunn eventually tries to rehash and start working back up to Darkseid and Justice League and stuff like that. But I hope he does it. I hope he takes a pit stop with the Justice Society and builds up some of those other Justice League villains that are out there, like, your Grods and your Amazos and Desperados and stuff like that, and start utilizing this huge library of Justice League villains to really get us invested in who they are as a team. I think that the thing that's going to help him is he has the universe building experience of what happened in the Marvel universe, where he's able to kind of create his own universe with its own rules with the Guardians of the Galaxy series, and took a bunch of characters that weren't really well known outside of the comic book sphere and give them personalities, but keep them in line enough to what comic book fans recognize. Because I'll be honest with you, before James Gunn touched Guardians of the Galaxy, he didn't nobody give a damn about Drax, bro. Like, we didn't care about Drax. We didn't know, Drax didn't really have much of a personality. Matter of fact, when I first started, when they first put me on to the Infinity Saga, I thought that Drax was some kind of other version of Hulk for a second. And they're like, oh, no, that's Drax. That's Drax. I read about him a long time ago. This is what he is now. But they took characters like Gamora and Drax. Rocket Raccoon did have a strong personality. I remember that from a long time ago. But Groot and all these other characters, and made them. They gave them their own personalities, but they still stayed in line with their comic book versions too. And I think he has that gift to do that, where you actually care about the characters more than anything else. So I'm interested to see what happens with DC. But at the same time, give him grace. Shit. Give a lot of these comic book these creators, these people that are making these movies, and these actors and directors and writers and stuff, give them a little bit of grace, because it used to be, the baseline used to be terrible, y'all. The baseline used to be trash. I'm telling you, the baseline used to be trash for comic book movies. I can't stress this enough, how bad it used to be. It used to be terrible. Don't think y'all understand this. Y'all don't hear me when I tell you how bad it used to be. I was hoping to get a couple more people to hop on with comments, but it seems like everybody's working today. But anyway, that's where I'm at with it. I'll probably going to chop this up into a podcast. There's going to be a lot of stuff that gets cut out of this one, so I can streamline it a little bit. I'm trying to get back into the groove and get back into the flow of doing content for this channel. And so I'm still trying to figure out what my voice is going to be on it. Moving forward, let me make sure I hit all my points with this one. I do think moving forward, we just got to accept that not every comic book movie is going to blow us away. Be cool with that, so we can be pleasantly surprised when one does. Like Blue Beetle, I heard people were really raving about how good Blue Beetle was. That's because they gave it a shot, and it came in and it genuinely surprised us, and that's dope. We got to stop with this high bar of expectation, expecting to be absolutely just completely blown away every time a new comic book movie drops. And I know that audience expectations have evolved throughout the years. And I know that there are people who weren't really, there are fans who weren't alive when some of those 90s era movies came out, or they weren't old enough to appreciate how terrible they are. And my challenge to you is go back and watch some of these terrible 90s and early 2000s comic book movies, and then come back and report back. See how bad it could be, and then compare it to how bad, compare it to nowadays, where at least you're going to get a competent movie. I know that we have this high bar of expectation to perfectly translate all the source material. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes translating the source material perfectly doesn't make a ton of sense. It just doesn't. With sliding time scales and stuff like that, it doesn't make a ton of sense for what they're trying to do by telling a story that actually takes place in a real world, even though it's a realistic fictionalized world. It doesn't always neatly line up. And so I think that we have to give a little bit of breathing room for these people to tell their own stories with these comic book characters. And at least as long as they look and function similarly, I think we can give them grace. Now, what I'm not allowing for is the serial killer Batman that brands his victims. That's the bridge too far for me. For other people, they're like, yeah, that sounds about right. I can't rock with the branding, Batman branding his logo on his victims. That's serial killer shit. And so that's where I draw my lines. I think the comic book industry actually, when there's a massive change in a movie that's well received, we start to see the reverberations rumbling through the comic books, where they start changing origin stories and stuff like that. We're seeing right now with Miss Marvel right now, where she's actually now, spoiler alert, cover your ears. You got 10 seconds. Spoiler alert, ends. So in the comic books, they've made Miss Marvel a mutant, and that's going to reflect on the big screen too. And we're starting to see more where the movies are actually influencing decisions in the comic books. And we even saw it with, um, you know, them deciding that we need to have a black Nick Fury to match the Nick Fury that we have on the screen, just so there's not this weird jarring cognitive dissonance. And so they took the OG Nick Fury and made him the man on the wall for a while, and then made him a watcher. I don't know if he's still a watcher or not, but the black Nick Fury Jr. And the story didn't make a ton of sense how they came up with it, but they wanted to make the comic version of Nick Fury look more like Samuel Jackson. So I guess that works. But give them a little bit of grace to adapt these stories, bro. Because to be honest with you, there's some comic book stories that are just ridiculous. Like, my fear is that they try to do like a Legion of Superheroes and try to adapt that to like the movie. Like, they tried it with Supergirl and it hit with mixed results. Like Supergirl, the TV show, they tried to adapt some Legion of Superhero stuff to that, and it hit with mixed results. They adapted the Justice Society in Stargirl, and that actually came across a little bit better. But give them a little bit of grace when they're adapting these stories. And like I said, we're seeing more comic books that are actually influenced by what happened on the screen, where even the way that they're drawing the characters looks more reflective of how the characters are presented in the movie versions. But there's a balance between the respect for the source material and allowing the creators to create. And so it's always a balance that's delicate. And when it gets crossed over, when it's too much of one and not enough of the other, that's when the fans start getting upset. So I support comic book movies as long as they try to keep a little bit in line with what makes something that looks kind of like the comic book, instead of making this thing that doesn't look anything like it at all. So I encourage y'all, go out, find some of these old comic book movies. They're streaming everywhere. Go sit down and watch the Dolph Lundgren Punisher movie. Go and watch Spawn. Go and watch some of these older comic book movies and compare them to the Marvel or DC movie that you think is the absolute worst, and report back. Report back to this thread. Report back to this live stream. You tell me if the worst, like, go, I defy you. I defy you to go watch Batman and Robin, and then watch The Dark Knight Rises and tell me that The Dark Knight Rises is worse than Batman and Robin. If it's not even in the same hemisphere. It's not even the same universe. I defy you to go and watch some of these old movies. And you can have a good time watching them. I'm not saying that they're going to be like just punishing to watch, but I defy you to go and watch some of these older ones when they're still trying to define what the standards are for the genre of movies, and come back to me and tell me what you think, and see how they hold up comparatively. So that's what I got. Again, it's kind of dope seeing the normalization of comic book movies to the point where we do have expectations and tropes within the genre. But this is what happens. It ends up becoming a little bit stale. When action movies hit in the 80s and 90s, they ended up developing their own tropes to the point where they develop parodies of those tropes. And so then you end up having movies like The Last Action Hero, which was kind of a send up of 90s action movies. There's nothing wrong with it. It's kind of just a sign of, to me, it's the sign of the genre maturing. So, yes, we're spoiled by actually competent comic book movies, because for a long time that's not what the case was. Go and watch some of them old joints and report back to me. I think that's all I got, y'all. If you have anything, drop it in. If you have any feedback or anything or any arguments, I'm gonna be monitoring this thread for a while, so you can drop comments in there. We can go back and forth about it. Tell me what some of your favorite bad comic book movies, like comic book movies that everybody hated that you secretly loved. Again, mine was, I love that Punisher Warzone, bro. That was the most violent thing ever. It was lit, bro. It didn't make a lick of sense, but it was amazing. It was like the most violent, jarring thing I've ever seen in my life. It was just an exploration of it. I think it was to the point where it's almost um, a subversive kind of. it felt like it felt like one of them subversive movies, bro. Um, so go and check them out, and be fair, you know, drop your biases, watch some of them old ones, and then compare them to the movies that you've been that the modern comic book movies that you decided that you hated. Because I've even had to keep it real with myself. Batman versus Superman, I didn't like it, but it definitely wasn't the absolute worst of the worst in terms of comic book movies. It's not even close. I'm old enough to remember how bad it really was. So that's all I got. I'm gonna keep dropping these live streams, hopefully on Fridays. As I get my office space at home kind of figured out, we're gonna be probably transitioning this, putting this show in um, my home office because I like my studio, but I kind of like it more for doing more formal stuff. My home one, I feel a little bit more. I don't know. It feels it's a different feeling doing stuff in the studio versus doing stuff at home. So that's kind of where I'm at. But yeah, I'm down for any discussion. I'm down for any argument. I'm down for any fight, y'all. Let's make this happen. So anyway, um, I will talk to y'all later. Again, tell me what comic book movies that you want to give a reconsideration to. Sit down and watch them, compare them against some of the worst ones that I've listed here, and report back. And then tell me what your favorite bad comic book movie is and why. Why is it your favorite? I'm really interested in hearing that. And so that's all I got. I'll talk to y'all later. Have a good weekend. Peace.